Chapter 1 Emergency. For the glory of Wegala Empire, you must die. Intruders snarled at me as I knelt on the floor. Please let me see Asher. Please, I begged. How dare you speak the name of our king? The soldiers growled and grabbed my hair, forcing me to raise my head. They were like shadows towering over me. Please, I need to talk to him. I'm pregnant. I have his baby, I cried. The head soldier snorted. Baby, you think you'd be qualified to deliver a baby for our king? Filthy whore. He won't come to you anymore. Don't you understand? He's with Lady Adeline. Now drink it. No. He pulled me harshly, gripped my face and pried my mouth open. Mysterious liquid flew down my throat. Burning. I began to gag. Die, you wretched moron. They spat at me before slamming the door. And I heard the click of the lock. I struggled to move, but my eyes felt swollen, and my legs were strengthless. The smell of smoke quickly filled the room. Fire engulfed me. My mind wandered as I stared out the window. The sky was a perfect clear blue, and the air was filled with the sound of children's laughter. A smile formed on my lips at the sound. Far beyond me, the pups, accompanied by their parents, made their way toward the forest not too far away from where I sat. It was finally time for the annual hunting festival, and the pups chattered and giggled with excitement as they tugged at their mothers' and fathers' sleeves. I remembered their innocent happiness well. When I had been a pup myself, I'd been infinitely impatient and raced far ahead of my father and brother, urging them the entire way to move faster. I'd been so excited to get a glimpse of the hunting group I wished to one day be a part of. I was eager to find my place amongst the pack. I'd been grown for a long time now, and yet, these pups had more freedom than me. Ever since the deadly inferno, I'd lost the ability to shift into my wolf form. My life had changed completely. I lost everything. My wolf, my name, my identity, and all I used to love and cherish. I'd moved far away and came to the wild crawler pack, where I'd lived as someone else ever since. Just as I was starting to feel the familiar ache of loneliness, the sound of footsteps rang out behind me. I snapped out of my stupor and turned to see Marley behind me. Sheesh, Cassandra, I almost fell asleep at my desk. Marley paused for a breath. She ran her hands through her thick dark hair. Her light green eyes were slightly bloodshot, but her small smile offset her tired aura. It's been such a crazy day. I couldn't help but doze off between patients. I understand completely, I agreed with her. Here, come sit down. We still have a while until our next appointment. Marley was my assistant here at the clinic. 5 years ago, when Emmett saved me from the fire and brought me to his pack, he taught me how to be a healer. And Marley had been my first patient. Shortly after I helped heal her, she decided she wanted to help others as well, and now she was my right-hand woman. Marley took a seat on the stool beside me and then glanced out the window. I can't believe it's already time for the hunting festival, she sighed, and she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The kids have been going crazy for days. I swear, they've been driving me absolutely insane, Cass. I'm sure, I'm used. The village has been loud all week. I wish I cared more, Marley admitted. But the festival really doesn't interest me much. Visitors from other packs are troublesome. Can you imagine? I was stopped by them 3 times this morning for the question, how to get to the forest. Gosh, can't they read signposts? They are everywhere on the streets. And with how crazy my kiddos have been. She let out a heavy sigh. I wish they could be more like your Finnick. He's such a good boy. Mine are little monsters, no matter what I do. Your lucky Finnick hasn't begged you to come with him. She paused for a moment, and a strange expression crossed her pretty face. Sorry, Cassandra, she said quietly. I didn't mean to bring that up. Marley knew I was unable to shift, and therefore, I was not allowed to enter the forest, even the safe zone. I simply gave her an understanding smile. Don't even worry about it. Besides, Finnick is too young to watch anyway. If he was of age, I'm sure circumstances would be different. It had been 5 years past since that calamity. I need to go on. So where is your sweet boy? Marley wondered with a curious expression. He's with the Luna and her children, I replied. I was grateful that the Luna of the Wild Crawler Pack had been so generous as to offer to watch my son while I ran the clinic. The hours were incredibly long, and my patient list had grown endless recently. Marley and I were busier than ever. A sickness was running through the Wild Crawler Pack, one with an unsure origin I had yet to place. It was accompanied by a peculiar mark on different parts of the patient's bodies, each slightly raised, red, and warm to the touch. I'd biopsied several of them, and yet, I hadn't found an answer that made any sort of sense. That's a good place for him. Marley interrupted my thoughts again, and then beyond us, bells rang out. She glanced up at the clock. Looks like it's time for our next patient. Ready to go? I nodded. Let's go. I offered my hand to Marley and helped her to her feet, and then we walked out into the front of the clinic, where our next patient was nervously awaiting us. She was a young woman named Anna, and her brown eyes were slightly glazed over. Her skin was pale and coated with a slight sheen of sweat, and her arms were wrapped around herself as she shivered. Marley and I escorted her to a room and sat her down on a comfortable seat. We took her temperature, her information, and listened as she described her symptoms. For a moment, I was worried she was ill with the mysterious sickness, but it seemed to just be a common cold. I prescribed her some medicine, and after she gratefully thanked me for helping her, the front door's bells rang out again. "Who is that?" Marley began to say, and suddenly, a tall man burst into the room. His dark clothing and the sword at his side indicated his rank. I recognized him immediately. It was Jasper, one of the Alpha's guards. I knew him very well, as he was often sent to collect me on behalf of the Alpha's family if medical attention was needed. "Hey, Jasper," I greeted him, and I flashed him a smile, assuming it would be returned. When it wasn't, I knew something was wrong. Jasper was always friendly with Marley and me when he came to the clinic, but today, his expression was deadly serious. "The Alpha needs you right away, Cassandra," he addressed me hurriedly. "You must accompany me to the pack house. It's an emergency." "What's wrong?" I asked, and worry painted my tone. "There isn't much time to explain," Jasper replied. "Long story short, a prestigious guest of ours has been bitten by a viper and needs medical attention immediately." Panic flooded through me. Snake bites weren't anything to mess with, and we needed to act fast. "Marley, finish up with Anna," I directed my assistant. "I'll get the kit together. Join me once you're finished." Marley nodded. "Go ahead, I'll handle things here." I hurriedly gathered my supplies, and then when Marley re-entered the room, we followed Jasper down the hall and through the door. After I locked the clinic door behind us, we raced out into the village and toward the pack house. We sped in silence, and after a while, I decided to ask for more information. "Who is this prestigious guest?" I wondered. "I cannot say," Jasper said curtly. "It's confidential." "Where did they come from?" I pressed. He said nothing at first, and then sighed. "Anamond." I flinched instinctively. Anamond was the capital of the Wegala Empire. It resided at the heart of the Crescent Pack, the biggest and most powerful pack that ruled our empire. It was also where the Alpha King lived, along with the higher-class werewolf families. Marley interrupted my thoughts. "The capital. They must be important." "Yes, they are. That's why we need to hurry up." Jasper nodded seriously. I tried to maintain an air of normality, and yet, my heart sank in my chest. I hadn't heard the name Anamond in the 5 years. The memories began to flood back through my mind before I could stop them. Images danced in my mind: the fire, the grins of the soldiers, and the poison that had been forced down my throat. Anamond was the place of my birth, and in the end, had been my nightmare. Chapter 2: Viper Bite. "Cassandra." Marley nudged me back into reality. Her pretty eyes were wide with concern. "Are you okay?" I gulped, and then nodded as I pushed away my memories of Anamond. "Yes." I managed to pull myself together. I needed to be level-headed if we were going to heal this patient. It didn't take us long to reach the pack house. The enormous mansion wasn't far from the clinic. When we crossed through the doors, we were surprised to see a crowd of people hustling around. The pack house seemed to be in a huge commotion, and I had to duck to avoid bumping into anyone around me. This was the most activity I'd seen here in a while. Wow, Marley remarked as Jasper led us down the hall. This must be serious. Everyone seems so upset. She tugged at Jasper's sleeve. Can you tell us what's going on? The Alpha will tell you once we find him, Jasper remarked. Oh, Marley replied, and she let out a sigh. So much secrecy. I wanted to ask follow-up questions, but Jasper's tone was so serious, I decided to wait. When we reached the end of the busy hall, a pair of people were waiting for us. One of them was Gareth, the Alpha of the wild crawler pack, and the other was his eldest son, Raiden. We bowed respectfully when we stopped in front of them. The Alpha of the wild crawler pack was a stern man, yet fair, and he was well respected amongst the pack. He was normally quite calm, but today, his brown eyes were wide with concern. Raiden wore a similar expression. Raiden was tall, with big, dark brown eyes, and black hair that glinted blue in the light, and his perfect teeth were white as pearls. He was slim, but covered in exotic tattoos, and girls in the pack admired his high cheekbones and fit frame. When I first arrived here 5 years ago, Raiden had been a young man of 16. Now he was all grown up, and it likely wouldn't be long until he took his father's place as Alpha of the wild crawlers. I was a little surprised to see him here at the pack house. The last time I'd seen him was 2 years ago at a dinner hosted by the Alpha's family. It had been a farewell dinner to celebrate Raiden's departure for the Wegala Empire's army, an elite group known as the Myriad. It was an honor to be recruited, and so we'd honored the young man accordingly. Cassandra, Gareth greeted me in a relieved tone, and then he looked at Marley. And Marley, I'm so glad to see you. Then he turned to Jasper. You can leave us. Thank you for collecting them for me. Of course, Jasper replied, and after he gave us a small smile, the guard turned and left us. After he disappeared down the hall, my attention turned to Raiden. He offered me a kind smile as we approached. Hello, Cassandra, he greeted me warmly, if not formally, and he nodded his head at me. Hi, Raiden, I replied politely. It's a surprise to see you here. It's been too long, he agreed, and then he looked at Gareth. If you'll excuse me, Father, I have some quick business to attend to. Of course, Gareth replied. Do what you need to do, son. Once he was gone, Gareth turned his attention to the young male servant standing politely in the corner. Please escort the doctor and her assistant to the second floor, he ordered in a stern voice. I must be going. Surprise flooded through me. The second floor of the pack house was usually reserved for the Alpha's family and their servants. It was considered private quarters while the first floor was used for meetings and dinners. Marley and I exchanged a glance. There was a bad feeling forming in the back of my mind, but I did my best to brush it away. Follow me, the servant addressed us, and after Marley and I offered polite nods toward Gareth, we followed him down the hall and up the stairs. At the top of the stairs was a pair of double doors, and on either side of them stood 4 guards. Much to my continued surprise, they weren't a part of the wild crawler, but the Crescent. Crescent guards. Marley whispered under her breath. She too recognized the special crest on the guard's shoulders. Her pale green eyes darted around the hall. What's going on here? I don't know, I admitted. I was just as curious as she was. This guest of honor must have been very important if there were so many heavily armed guards outside of the door. The guards stared at us coldly as we approached the door, but they stood aside and allowed us to enter the chamber anyway. The moment the doors flew open, a chorus of sounds flew toward us. A tingle of anxiety moved through me, but I managed to remain calm. The cavernous room was pure chaos. The curtains were closed, and the only light in the room came from candles and the fireplace that blazed with a crackling fire. Servants rushed around hastily, a few with piles of towels, and others with trays of various foods, drinks, and other supplies. They all seemed to hover around a specific part of the room, and when a few moved out of the way, I noticed a large, canopied bed. At the center of the bed was a young boy, around the same age as my Finnick. Servants attended to the boy, and even from across the room, I could see his lips were blue. Perspiration ran down his face and his eyes were squeezed tightly shut. He was clearly in pain, and his expression broke my heart. There's our patient, Marley noted sadly as we followed the servant toward the bed. Poor thing. We'll take care of him, I assured her. As we walked, I pulled my waist-length copper hair into a ponytail and steadied my nerves. I needed to have my wits about me if I was going to heal the poor boy. When we got closer, I noticed the Luna of the wild crawler pack, Sophia Bailey, stood beside the bed. She was just as beautiful as ever, but her short dark hair was a little out of place, and her skin was paler than usual. When she heard our footsteps, she turned her attention to me and I noticed her eyes were underscored by light purple shadows. Oh, Cassandra, she sighed in relief. Thank goodness you're here. The Luna's beautiful face looked tired, but she managed to smile at me anyway. The boys are downstairs with a maid, she answered before I could ask. They're safe and playing quietly. I nodded. Good. I'm glad they're okay. Now, how's our patient? Not as good, I'm afraid, Sophia lamented, and she nodded her head toward the young boy. Please, doctor, you must do something to help him. I fear he's in a great deal of pain, and nothing we've been doing seems to be working. I nodded again. Of course. You're in good hands now. I promise I'll do everything in my power to help. Thank you, Sophia whispered, and then she stood aside so Marley and I could approach. I crouched down beside the boy, and when I placed my hand gently on his forehead, I was surprised to find he was hot to the touch. He'd already broken out in a fever. I glanced over at Marley and waved her forward. Marley, can you prepare the heart rate monitor? Marley nodded, and as she opened up the kit, I turned back to the boy. My eyes traveled down until they reached his right leg. His trousers had been rolled up, and the skin of his ankles was ghostly white, except for a huge swollen area. Clear canine marks were dug deep into the tensor skin, and a low sigh escaped me. Poor thing, I whispered. I retrieved a pair of gloves from my pocket and pulled them on. As I carefully examined the bite marks closer, a string of thoughts formed in my mind. Where would the boy have encountered a viper? There hadn't been any reports of serpents recently, at least not in the forests of the wild crawler pack, and besides, at his age, he wouldn't have been allowed past the safe zone. So where had the snake come from? I turned to Sophia. Did they happen to catch the viper that inflicted the bite? The Luna appeared unsure, and her eyes flicked over to a point beyond me. No, a deep, smoky voice said behind me. The guards are still searching the forest for the wretched thing. A tingle ran down my spine. I'd know that voice anywhere. For a moment, I was frozen in place, but after a deep breath, I turned around. A man stood in the darkened corner, tucked away just far enough that I hadn't been able to sense him initially. He lingered in the shadows for a moment and then stepped toward me. My heart skipped a beat when his rugged but handsome face was revealed. Though he'd changed a little with time, his cold gray eyes were the same, and they bore into mine with intensity as he advanced closer. The tall man was none other than Asher Collins, the Alpha of the Crescent Pack and the King of the Wegala Empire. But none of that mattered to me. He was much more than just the legendary leader of all werewolves. He was my mate. All those years ago, he'd left me in that house, pregnant and alone to face the inferno. Chapter 3 Alpha King. Well, then you'll have to tell them to hurry up and find the beast, Marley remarked beside me, and she rolled her pretty eyes in annoyance. The sooner the better. The room suddenly grew heavy and my eyes widened. While part of me agreed with her sentiment, I couldn't believe she'd been so bold as to say that to the Alpha King. Of course, I wasn't fully convinced that my friend knew that's who she'd been addressing. If she had, I doubt she'd have spoken so tersely. Marley, Sophia exclaimed. The Luna looked shocked and embarrassed at my assistant's outburst, and her cheeks flushed scarlet. Asher's eyes narrowed, and the room fell silent. Your Majesty, please excuse her, Sophia begged, and she offered the Alpha King an apologetic expression and a small bow. Asher raised his hand, and the Luna immediately froze in place and shut her mouth. Wait, Your Majesty, Marley whispered. Oh, holy shit. Her expression was awestruck. Clearly, she'd realized who had been addressing us, and her cheeks darkened until they were the same color as Sophia's. Shish, I whispered as quietly as possible. Luckily, neither Sophia nor the Alpha King seemed to hear us. Instead, Asher released a huffy sigh. Are these two qualified, Sophia? He asked, and his gray eyes bore into mine intensely. My son deserves the utmost care, and I will not allow him to be treated by anyone who doesn't know what they're doing. His son. Had I heard him correctly? That explained the severity and amount of guards around us, not to mention Gareth and Sophia's worried expressions. The boy was the son of the Alpha King, and heir to the Wegala Empire. His survival was not only of the utmost importance, but it was in mine and Marley's hands. No pressure or anything. Yes, Your Majesty, Sophia answered him. Cassie is the best healer in our pack. If anyone can take care of him, it's her. The Alpha King's eyes continued to study me carefully. Cassie, he repeated back in a confused voice. My heart thrummed in my chest as if it was ready to burst forth as I stared back at Asher. It had been 5 years since I'd seen his handsome face, and my entire body felt like it would explode from the sheer emotion of it all. I never thought I'd see him again, yet here he was, standing before me with the same gray eyes I'd peered into with all my love so many years ago. The whole world seemed to melt away as I stared back at him. While the years and likely stress of his position had aged him slightly, he was just as handsome as he was back then. His dark hair fell to his shoulders in soft waves and his skin was perfectly tan and clear. He was muscular yet lean, and with his arms folded in front of him, I could see the prominent veins that came with much physical training. Even after all of these years, Asher Collins was still the most beautiful man I'd ever seen. But he was no longer mine, and I was no longer his. Your name is Cassie. He addressed me directly. He leaned in closer as if to examine me, and it took all of my effort to keep from shaking. For a moment, I thought he'd find a clue of my past identity, but I knew in my heart that I looked too different now to recognize. The inferno had destroyed my face, distorted my voice, and taken my wolf away. No part of my past identity had remained. Asher could stare all he want. I was no longer the same woman I once was. Cassandra, I replied politely. My name is Cassandra Keller, Your Majesty. The Alpha King paused for a moment. You're the best, he asked, and when I didn't answer, he clarified. Healer, that is. For a moment, I considered being humble, but his stern expression told me I needed to be confident in my abilities. Yes, I said. Yes, Your Majesty. I've been taking care of this pack for many years. I'm well versed in injuries, illnesses, and bites such as the one your son has sustained. My assistant, Marley, is also well qualified. We're going to do everything we can to help. Okay, Cassandra, he said in a low voice that sent a chill down my spine. Let's see what you can do. His expression softened slightly, but not enough to appear friendly. Still, I took a long, deep breath, and then addressed him calmly. I'll do my best, I promised, and I fought back a shiver. But it will be difficult to find the cure to the boy's bite without first identifying the viper. Different snakes have different venom, and the severity of his injury will depend on the breed and size of the creature. For a moment, I expected more resistance, but Asher simply nodded. Guards, he called out in a stern and regal tone, and without further question, the guards who'd been stationed at the outside doors appeared before us. Once they were in position, Asher straightened his stance and held his head high. Please tell Alpha Gareth that more search squads will need to be sent to the forest, he said. We need to locate the viper as soon as possible so the doctors can properly address my son's wounds. Please make haste. Time is of the essence. Yes, Your Majesty, the guards replied in unison, and after each offered the Alpha King uniform bows, they rushed out of the chamber and shut the doors behind them. Asher raised his chin toward us. If you can't heal my son, I'll let the whole pack die with him. His warning was stated calmly, as if it were just another sentence, but the rest of us felt the weight of his words crash over it. A lump formed in my throat, and when I glanced over at Sophia, her face grew pale. Marley's expression was no better, and as I looked around the room, the servants held similar looks of fear. The Alpha King was no one to mess with. We needed to keep our wits about us. So, without another word, I motioned toward Marley, and the pair of us turned our attention back to the boy. I'll leave you to it, Cassie, Sophia said quietly. I'm going to check on Finnick and the boys downstairs. Thank you, I said, and I offered the Luna a small nod of respect. She smiled back at me, and then she left the chamber. Marley and I got to work and started to fully examine the bite on the young prince's bite. It had worsened even since Marley and I had arrived, and knew Asher was right. Time was of the essence. We needed to act fast if we were going to save his life. Can we do this? Marley whispered just loud enough for me to hear. Cassandra, this looks bad. We have no choice in the matter, I reminded her gently. Besides, we've dealt with worse before. We can do this, Marley. My assistant paused for a moment, and then she nodded. You're right. Let's get to work. Chapter 4. He said stay. The next few hours passed by laboriously. As we waited for the guards to return with some sort of news about the Viper, Marley and I did all we could to keep the boy comfortable. We took his temperature, monitored his heart rate, and continued to apply cold compresses to keep his fever from rising any higher. Meanwhile, it took all of my concentration to remain perfectly focused on the boy. My mind was trying to wander to different places, and Asher Collins wasn't helping. The Alpha King remained close to us as we attended to his son, and it was unclear if he was monitoring our treatment or just studying me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up as chills continuously ran down my spine. I wasn't the kind of woman who got nervous easily, but the Alpha King's very presence set every inch of my body on edge. Of all of the people to be here, he was the last one I'd ever have expected, and my emotions were running wild. I wasn't sure whether to cry or be relieved to see him after so long. All I knew was that this was unbelievably complicated. After long, a pair of guards returned. They'd finally tracked down the Viper. Luckily, it was one that I'd seen in a medical book. I relayed all of the information I knew to Marley and Asher, and the pair of them seemed relieved to know there was a potential cure. The Alpha King had assigned guards to accompany Marley back to the clinic to procure the herbs needed to heal the boy. My assistant seemed nervous to be surrounded by such heavily weaponed men, but she accepted the help. Half an hour later, she returned with the herbs, and we got to work. We prepared a salve to apply directly to the wound, and then used others to brew a tea that would treat the boy internally. The prince was weak, but we managed to help him get enough of the tea into his system to treat him properly. Hours passed by, and by dusk, the boy finally became stable. After much fitful moaning and crying, he'd finally fallen into a quiet sleep. The blueness of his lips had disappeared, and color had returned to his cheeks. Beneath the salve, the swollenness of the bite had eased. Once he was sustained, I sent Marley back home. She put up a bit of a fight and insisted on staying with me, but I pushed back and told her she needed to go back to her boys. They're going to be excited to show you what they hunted in the forest, I'd reminded her. They need you more than I do right now. After a little more convincing, Marley agreed to go, and once she packed up and left the pack house, I'd turned to the rest of the people standing around in the chamber and asked for some time alone with my patient. The guards seemed hesitant to leave me alone with the prince, but the Alpha King heeded my request and ordered the others to do the same. They filtered out of the chamber, and once they were gone, I released a sigh. As much as the quiet was nice, asking everyone to leave us was more of an excuse than anything. My patient was stable, but I needed time to think and process the emotions that swirled around in my mind like a storm. I hadn't been prepared to see Asher again, and I was surprised to see just how much he'd changed over the years. He was the Alpha King now, and as such, he was the ruthless leader of the Wegala Empire. In the past, he'd seemed hesitant to take on the position, but it seemed like he'd embraced his destiny. Not only that, but he had a son. I glanced over at the boy. Was he also the son of Adeline Moses? A pang of sadness struck me. He had to be. Asher had abandoned me all those years ago and left me to suffer for the sake of marrying Adeline. It would make sense that he'd have a son with her. My chest suddenly felt tight, and for a moment, I thought I was about to cry, but I forced those feelings down. Asher Collins was the Alpha King now. What he did was none of my business anymore, and I couldn't let him affect me like this. Besides, I had Finnick and my career here in the wild crawler pack, not to mention my dear friend Marley and her family. I was loved and respected here, and that's all I needed. I looked back at the prince. He reminded me a little of Finnick, though they didn't look alike. The prince had a sweet round face and soft curly hair, just like his mother, Adeline. She'd been the most beautiful she-wolf in the Crescent Pack, so it was unsurprising her son took after her. My Finnick had a more serious appearance, much like his father. He was cute, but there was something mature and intelligent in his eyes. Suddenly, a soft whimper interrupted my thoughts, and when I looked over, I watched the prince roll on his side. His sheets were thoroughly soaked from perspiration, and his forehead appeared damp as well. "Oh, sweetheart," I murmured, and I hopped to my feet. The poor child was at risk of catching a cold. I rushed over to the door, and peeked my head out. A pair of guards stood at attention, and they stared at me with expressions of concern. "I need a servant," I said. "The prince needs a fresh set of blankets." The guards nodded, and one of them disappeared down the hall. I stepped back into the chamber, and a few minutes later, the doors flew open to reveal a pair of servants with piles of fresh linens. But they weren't alone. Asher Collins walked in with them, and his gray eyes flashed with concern. "How is he?" he demanded as he rushed over, but when he caught sight of his son, his expression softened. "Better," I answered gently. "I just thought he would be more comfortable with fresh sheets." "Oh," Asher said simply, and he nodded. It was clear that he was a caring father, and it was strange to see him in this light. I stepped aside as the servants changed the prince's sheets, and as Asher spoke quietly to his son, I felt a lump form once again in my throat. My stomach turned, and for a moment, I thought I was going to throw up. Tears welled in my eyes, and I dug my nails into my palms. This was too hard. Once the servants were done, they left the chamber, and I wanted to follow. So, I turned to Asher. "Your son just needs rest," I managed to say. "He's recovering quite well, so I think I should take my leave." Before he could say another word, I turned on my heels and headed toward the doors. I'd nearly made it there when Asher's voice rang through the chamber. "Stay," he demanded. I froze for a moment, and then took a step forward. Then he spoke again, his voice hardened and deadly serious. I said stay. Chapter 5 Gray Eyes. I was stunned by the severity of his tone. He wasn't addressing me as Asher Collins. He was ordering me as the Alpha King. The last thing I wanted was to stay in the chamber alone with him and the sleeping prince, but as much as I wanted to disobey his order, I knew I had no choice. He was the ruler of the realm, and I could face horrible consequences if I didn't obey. So, I turned back around. I was about to walk back over to the bed when a thought crossed my mind. My apologies, Your Majesty, but I need to go and take care of my son, I explained, and it took all of my effort to keep my voice steady. Your son, Asher repeated back, and he crossed his arms against his chest. Yes, my son, I answered. He's waiting for me. I've been working all day, so I haven't had the chance to see him yet. Where is he? The Alpha King pressed. His gray eyes narrowed as if he didn't wish to let me leave. He is with the Luna Sophia's children, I answered. Downstairs, I believe. Quote. He will be brought here then, Asher replied, and he raised his chin. You cannot leave before my son awakens. His tone was even harsher than his first demand, and a chill ran down my spine. A guard will collect your son, he said. You will remain here with mine. Is there anything you need in the meantime? I shook my head. No, Your Majesty. I have all I need right here. Then take a seat, he ordered. I will speak with my guard at once. I nodded politely, and then walked back over to the side of the room. I took a seat beside the prince's bed. Meanwhile, Asher crossed over to the double doors. He poked his head out and spoke to the guards in a commanding voice. Then the doors closed again. As Asher walked back toward me, I felt my hands begin to shake. There was no way the Alpha King could see my Finnick, but what could I do? The plan had already been set in motion, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. All I could do was hope the prince would awaken so I could leave the pack house with my son and put this day behind me. Asher took a seat opposite me, and when he wasn't looking, I carefully scooted my seat back a little. There wasn't much I could do to stay away from him, but I would try my best to maintain distance. I was scared he could hear how fast my heart was racing in my chest or how my breath was uneven. I was worried he could tell I was uneasy. I couldn't risk him being suspicious about any of this. We spent our time in an uncomfortable silence. Asher's eyes remained fixed on his son, and I tried to look elsewhere to avoid him. All the while, I prayed the Alpha King's son would awaken, and the attention would be taken away from this entire interaction. Suddenly, the doors of the chamber flew open, and moments later, a set of footsteps rang out against the polished wood floors. "Mommy!" Finnick exclaimed happily, and when I looked up, I saw my son headed toward me at full speed. Once he reached me, I wrapped my arms around him and drew him into a hug. "Finnick," I said, and I planted a kiss on his forehead. "Mommy, where have you been?" Finnick wondered, and he tilted his head to the side slightly. "I missed you." He frowned and pouted ever so slightly. I fought back a laugh at his expression and smiled. Despite the look on his face, Finnick's words brought me happiness. Our bond was wonderful, and my son always brought me joy no matter what. He had been the reason I'd been able to carry on for the past 5 years and was my entire reason for living. "I've missed you too, honey," I said, and I softened my voice. "We need to stay quiet, all right?" Finnick nodded. "Okay, Mommy." "Did you have a good day?" I asked, and Finnick's face lit up. He was about to speak when he glanced over at the sleeping boy beside us. He raised a finger to his lips and then nodded again. "Yes," he whispered considerately. "We played hide and seek in the garden, and then Auntie Sophia taught us how to draw a flower. Dominic said it was called a dandelion." Dominic was Sophia's son, and he was around Finnick's age. They were dear friends, and Finnick thought of the Luna's son like a brother. "A dandelion," I repeated back quietly. "Oh wow. Do you have the picture with you?" Finnick nodded happily, and then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small piece of paper and handed it to me excitedly. I opened the folded paper carefully, and my lips curled into a smile. He'd indeed drawn a dandelion, and he'd done a great job. "This looks great, Finnick," I complimented him. "Can I keep this?" "Of course, Mommy," Finnick replied. It was then I remembered Asher. I glanced over at him, and when we made eye contact, a feeling of dread ran through me. Had he been watching us this entire time? My heart skipped a beat, but I quickly looked back to Finnick. "Thank you," I said, and I kissed his forehead. Finnick grinned and then gave me a huge hug. Once he pulled away, he looked over at the sleeping prince. "Is he sick?" Finnick wondered. I nodded. "He was bitten by a viper in the forest. But he's healing up and should be better soon." My son's round eyes widened. "A viper," he repeated back quietly. "Oh no. That's why I don't like the forest. Too many scary things. I hope he feels better soon." "Me too, darling," I said. Finnick studied the prince carefully, and I could tell he felt bad for him. My son was so considerate for someone so young, and he contained more empathy than some of the more grown men I knew. He was so kind and caring, and was always looking out for other people's feelings, especially mine. "Wait, Mommy, who's he?" Finnick asked, and this time, he was staring right at Asher. My heart skipped again as I searched my mind for an answer. How would I explain who he was to my son? Before I could say anything, Finnick gasped and pointed at Asher. "Look, Mommy, he has the same gray eyes as me," he remarked in awe. "But you said it was rare to have this color eyes." My own eyes widened and I froze. Asher's attention fell to my son, and his lips parted ever so slightly. He'd noticed it too. Chapter 6. Back to her nightmare. My lip quivered as I searched for an explanation, and Asher rose from his seat. However, just as the Alpha King took a step toward us, the sleeping prince's eyes opened. "Daddy," the young boy managed. "What happened?" Asher seemed to forget about us completely and turned his full attention to his son. He squatted down beside the boy and took his hand. "You're awake," he said in relief. "Oh, thank goodness. Do you feel any better now?" His tone was gentle, something I'd never heard from him before. Or perhaps I had, but the memories were buried now. The young prince nodded and smiled at his father. I feel better now, Daddy. Do you remember what happened? Asher asked quietly, and when the boy shook his head, he sighed. That's all right. What's important is that you're safe and feeling better than before. I'm so relieved. As he held his son's hand, I noticed Finnick gazing at them longingly. It tugged at my heartstrings, but there was nothing I could do except get the both of us away from here. We need to go, I whispered, and I carefully took his hand in mine. Finnick's eyes flashed, and for a moment, he appeared son to know better. The prince was young. Hopefully he would learn differently in time. That's the healer, Asher answered, and after he brushed the prince's hair away from his forehead. She took care of you. The intimate action took me by surprise. Asher wasn't one to show affection, at least he hadn't been back then. But he was clearly different now. Oh, his son remarked, but he didn't seem too impressed. What did she heal me from? I don't understand. You were bitten by a viper, Finnick spoke up helpfully. Shish, I whispered, and I rested my hand on his shoulder. Finnick. A viper, the prince repeated back, and his face grew alarmed. You mean a snake? I hate snakes, Daddy. Yes, Asher answered, and his eyes shot daggers in our direction. You were bitten by a viper. But you're all right now. Cassandra and her attendant took good care of you and you're going to be just fine. They gave you medicine and herbs to drink. Do you remember that? The prince frowned. No, I don't remember. Asher's eyebrows creased together in concern. It's probably from the fever, Your Majesty, I spoke up in an attempt to ease the situation. It isn't unusual for someone who's been under such stress and fever to not remember what they've been through. He's likely very tired and just needs some more rest. The Alpha King didn't look fully convinced. His gray eyes looked like storm clouds as they glared at me, and for a moment, I was worried he was going to say something bad in front of Finnick. Asher had been prone to temperamental outbursts in the years I'd known him, and I wasn't sure if that side of him still remained. Luckily for us all, he softened his expression, and laid his hand on his son's shoulder. You heard the healer, he remarked. You just need some rest, son. You'll be just fine. Oh, the boy said again, and he went back to ignoring us. Finnick tugged at my sleeve nervously, and I ran my hand through his hair. I'd never wanted to leave the pack house more than I did at this moment. Can we leave, Your Majesty? I decided to ask again. My son could use some rest as well, and we live a little distance from here. An eternity passed as I waited for an answer. Finally, after a minute, Asher glanced over at me. You can leave, Cassandra, the Alpha King said in a bored tone of voice. Relief flooded through me and it took all of my patience to keep from sighing. Thank you, Your Majesty, I started to say, but he cut me off with a raise of his hand. When you return home, pack your things, he said sternly. You'll be leaving with us in 2 days' time. My jaw dropped open. Leaving? What did he mean by that? Excuse me, I managed to say. What do you mean, Your Majesty? You're returning with us to Anamond, the Alpha King said without looking at me, and my heart dropped. What? I blurted out, and for a moment, I forgot to maintain an air of respect. What in the world did Asher Collins mean? Why would I be returning with him to Anamond? It should be simple enough for you to understand, Asher sighed, and when he glanced over at me, he raised an eyebrow. I need to make sure Marco fully recovers and that there's nothing suspicious about the herbs you used on him. The royal family cannot be too cautious, not these days, and besides, you should be honored to be allowed to enter Anamond. Not many in your station are allowed into the capital. Silence fell as his words crashed over me, and I broke into a panic. Anamond. I'd done everything in my power to forget everything that had happened there. And now he wanted me to face it all again. Chapter 7 Bad Guy. Mommy, what's going on? Finnick whispered, and he stared up at me with widened eyes. I froze in place, unsure of how to answer him. Surely, the Alpha King couldn't be serious. Me, go with him to Anamond. I studied Asher's expression and wondered if he'd seen past my changed face and voice. Had he discovered it was me after all? No, there was no way. Regardless, why would he bring me there? As the capital city of the Wegala Empire, there were countless outstanding healers that resided there. While I knew I was good at my job, I didn't believe for a moment that I was any more talented than any of them. If anything, I could just write down the list of herbs I'd used and have the servants pass it along to the royal healers, and if something was amiss, they knew where to find me. I don't understand, Your Majesty, I asked him. Why bring me all the way to Anamond? Must I repeat myself? The Alpha King sighed and he shook his head in frustration. I thought you were smart, but perhaps I'm giving you too much credit. Anger spiked within me, but I ignored it. Begging your pardon, but I have patients here in the wild crawler pack I must attend to, I brought up in hopes he'd change his mind. Many of them require treatment that only I can administer. Isn't that why you have an assistant? Asher retorted. Well, yes, I admitted. But I can't just leave her to do all of the work. It takes both of us to run the clinic. This isn't a discussion, Cassandra. His voice hardened as his impatience grew. It's an order. You will comply or else suffer the consequences. I doubt you wish to subject your son to any sort of punishment. The Alpha King was right. I couldn't refuse, not when it was a royal decree. I had to do what was right and keep Finnick from harm's way. No, Your Majesty, I replied quickly, and I held Finnick close. Now, leave us, Asher commanded. Return home and prepare your things. Yes, I said, and after I rose to my feet, I bowed in respect. Your Majesty. Finnick and I left without another word, and once the doors were closed behind us, my son grabbed my hand. Mommy, he whispered. He scares me. Shish, I whispered back, and I glanced around to make sure no one had heard him. You mustn't say such things, not until we're home, okay? Sorry, he apologized. I led Finnick down the stairs, and after I waved goodbye to Jasper, we left the pack house. It was nearly nightfall, and the moon shone bright above us as we walked down the gray stone path back toward town. Did you eat dinner? I asked Finnick, and my son nodded. Yes, he said. Auntie Sophia gave us soup and crackers. Good, I replied simply, and I made note to thank the Luna for watching my son and taking care of him while I was working. As we headed toward our house, a few pack members greeted us and wished us good evenings. I kept my responses polite but short. Now was the time the pack members would be heading home to celebrate their harvests, but I wanted nothing to do with any of it. Even if I had, I needed time to process everything that had happened that day. Finnick stayed close to me, his fingers wrapped tightly around mine. I knew he could sense my frustration, so he remained quiet as we quickly walked, but after a while, he started to lag behind me. Soon, I dropped his hand without really noticing until he called after me. Mommy, he said, please slow down. When I turned around, I noticed he'd stopped and was panting about 10 feet behind me. I rushed over to him and crouched down so I was eye level. I'm sorry, honey, I apologized. I didn't realize I was walking so fast. It's okay, Finnick replied as he caught his breath. Once he was calm, his eyebrows creased together. You look sad, Mommy. No, I'm fine, darling, I assured him, but he wasn't convinced by my words. You said we don't lie to each other, he insisted, and his face was completely serious. He was such a sensitive soul, and I knew he could tell I wasn't okay. But what could I say? How could I explain the situation in a way that a child could understand? Do you want to go to Anamond? I asked him softly, and he immediately shook his head. No, he said. Why not? I asked. You don't want to, he replied as if it was obvious. If Mommy doesn't like it, then I don't like it. My sweet, loyal boy. He was so special, so empathetic. I smiled at him, and drew him into a hug. After a moment, I let go, and we resumed our walk. As we continued on, Finnick started asking more questions, and I did my best to answer him without revealing too much. Mommy, he was that strange man. He wondered. You called him, Majesty. He's, an important official, I explained simply. Is he from Anamond? Finnick asked. I nodded. Yes. Is he a bad guy? I paused, unsure of how to answer him. I don't know, I finally admitted. I don't know much about him, Finnick. Oh, Finnick replied, and that was that. We didn't talk about anything else the rest of the way home. Once we got back to our small house, I carried Finnick up the stairs to his bedroom and carefully helped him into his pajamas. After he brushed his teeth, I brought him a glass of water and then tucked him into bed. Normally, I read him a story before bed, but neither of us seemed interested in that ritual tonight. So instead, I crawled under the covers with him and snuggled him beside me. He rested his head against me, and I ran my fingers through his soft hair, just like I had when he was a baby. Mommy, Finnick asked in a clear voice, and before the words left his mouth, I knew what he was about to ask. Yes, my love, I replied calmly, even though my heart raced in my chest. Why did that man have gray eyes like mine? He wondered. He sat up and turned his body around to face mine. His curious eyes were wider than I'd ever seen them, and his lower lip trembled slightly. I don't know, I whispered, but Finnick grabbed my hand. He took a deep breath and then tilted his head to the side. Mommy, you told me it was the color of an angel's wings, he said. You said it was a nice color. It is, my love, I said. But the man wasn't an angel, was he? He whispered so softly I almost didn't hear him. He is a bad guy. Shish, I said, and I brought the covers up over us. Let's get some sleep, okay? Okay, Finnick replied. I snuggled him closer against me, and as he fell asleep in my arms, I couldn't help but wonder if my child was right. Was Asher Collins a bad guy? Chapter 8. She had to run. I remained in bed with Finnick for a while and stared lovingly at his adorable face as he dreamt. Part of me could have stayed here forever, holding my sweet baby boy in my arms, but the other part knew there was so much to do. I carefully tucked Finnick deep into the covers, and once I was sure he wasn't going to wake, I quietly slipped out of his room and headed toward mine down the hall. I gently closed the door behind me, and once it was shut, I released the sigh I'd been holding onto for hours now. This was all such a mess, and there was only one thing I could do. I had to pack not for Anamond, but somewhere else. I needed to take Finnick and run as far away as we could. I didn't see any other choice. My son and I couldn't go to Anamond. So, I started moving around my room and got to packing. I grabbed only the essentials: a few pairs of clothes, some money I'd stashed away, necessary toiletries, and the legal documents I needed to hold onto for Finnick's sake. We wouldn't need much for now and couldn't afford to be bogged down by material possessions. In a little while, I would pack a bag for Finnick. I knew this was going to upset him, but I saw no other option. I would try to entice the offer as much as I could, but with how sensitive he was, I could only hope he would understand one day. After I had some things set aside, I went to the bathroom and splashed some water on my face. When I stared at the mirror, I noticed my dark green eyes were bloodshot and my skin was paler than normal. I looked like a wreck, but I couldn't worry about that now. So, I returned quietly to my room and found a notebook. I tore out a page and wrote a well-thought-out note to Marley explaining the circumstances of my leaving. I knew that if my friend didn't see me at the clinic tomorrow, she'd show up at my house and try to figure out what was going on. I knew this was going to be difficult for Marley. The clinic was crowded with so many patients sick with whatever illness was plaguing the pack. It was difficult to manage it all with two people, so I could barely imagine how she could do it all on her own. But I had no other choice. Besides, Marley was well qualified and a talented enough doctor to handle it. I knew she would understand, especially when she got to the part of the note about Finnick. She knew our children were the world to us, and as my friend, I knew she would want what was best for the both of us. Maybe, once everything was settled down, I could come back. The Alpha King would likely lose interest in a healer from a small backwoods pack quickly. Perhaps it would all blow over in a couple of weeks, and Finnick and I could resume the lives we'd built here. Until then, we had to run. I hadn't been fully convinced of this decision until Finnick had asked his questions. If I'd obeyed orders, things would have become too dangerous for my son. He was eager to know all about the Alpha King, and I couldn't fault him for his eagerness. So, we had to leave. I was too afraid that Asher would find out about Finnick's identity and lineage. I couldn't lose my son. We had to get as far away from Asher Collins as possible. I looked around at my room. It was paining me to know that we would have to leave all of this behind indefinitely. It was then I thought of Emmett. This had been Emmett's house. When he'd saved me from the deadly inferno 5 years ago, he'd brought me out here. I'd been covered in blisters and my skin had been marred and bloody. It took months to fully heal from the damage I'd sustained, but Emmett took the time to cure me. He'd saved my life and gave me shelter. Once I was better, he taught me to be the healer I now was. Emmett had even married me so I could legally stay here in the wild crawler pack. He didn't love me, of course, but he still did it all anyway. One day, I'd asked him why he had done all of this, why he'd take this risk to save someone who should have been dead back in Anamond. I asked why he'd bothered to save someone the royal family had wanted dead. He'd gotten a strange look on his face and then offered me a simple answer. It's a healer's duty to help someone sick or in pain. Since then, I'd carried on this duty and worked hard to become a healer like him. I wanted to repay his gratitude by working hard and making a name for myself. Emmett had died a year ago. He had been on his way to a neighboring pack to help a patient, but he never returned. Reportedly, he'd been attacked, but they never found his body. I found it hard to accept that he was gone, but only because he had been so strong. He was a very capable werewolf, though he hardly ever showed off his physical strength to others. Someone weak would not have been able to save me in that inferno, not to mention heal me over the course of a few months. So, I held on to hope that he was still alive. I remained here in the wild crawler pack and ran his clinic while I waited for him to return. A small part of me wondered if I was being overly optimistic. After all, there was a small chance that he had died in some kind of accident or attack. Or maybe, he just didn't want to return. He had been a rover long before we'd met. Perhaps he'd gone back to that life and couldn't say goodbye to me. I could have left long ago. In fact, I should have left Wegala and settled down elsewhere, somewhere far away from my past where I wouldn't have to worry or be under the rule of someone like Asher Collins. But, there was no time like the present. I couldn't wait any longer, not when the danger was nearly at our doorstep. I wouldn't go back to Anamond and neither would my son. I glanced over at the clock. It was approaching midnight. The guards would begin their night shift soon, but I had to take my chances. The wild crawler pack was at the territory border of Wegala. If I could get us out of here and through the forest, we could leave Wegala. We finally could leave my past, Asher Collins, and the threat of losing my son behind us forever. I took a long deep breath and headed down the hall toward Finnick's room. We had to go, and we had to go now if we were going to have any shot at surviving. Chapter 9 Attack. When I entered my son's room, I half expected him to be awake, but he was fast asleep. He had his arms wrapped around his favorite teddy bear, Teddy, and for a moment, I didn't want to wake him up. He seemed so peaceful, and I was about to put him through so much stress. But not as much as I would be if we went to Anamond. So, I leaned down and gently touched his arm. Finnick, I whispered, and when he didn't rouse, I said his name again. After a moment, his nose crinkled and his eyes blinked open. Mommy, he said, and he yawned lightly. Sorry to wake you, baby, I said, and I gave him my most apologetic smile. We have to go. Go, he repeated back in a confused voice. Go where? I'll tell you on the way there, I explained. For now, we just need to get ready, okay? Finnick nodded, though his gray eyes were concerned. I pulled the covers aside and helped him down. We walked over to the closet, and we got him dressed. After I zipped up his jacket, I picked out a couple of fresh sets of clothes and packed them in a small backpack. Put this on, I instructed him. Can Teddy come? He asked hopefully, and he glanced over at the stuffed bear he'd left on the bed. I studied the toy carefully. We were running low on room, but Teddy was his favorite toy. I couldn't ask him to leave it behind when I was already asking so much of him. Okay, I said, but we have to put him in your backpack, okay? Okay, Finnick agreed. We carefully put Teddy in his bag, and once he was secure it was time for shoes. Finnick and I went downstairs, and after we were fully dressed, I did a quick scan of the house. It seemed like I had remembered everything we needed. I glanced at the clock. It was time to go. I scooped Finnick into my arms and held him close. "Hold on tight, baby," I said, and I wrapped my jacket around him to conceal him further. I carried him out of the house and into the night. The street was completely empty, with only the streetlights out to light our way. I glanced around and made sure we were alone. Luckily, everyone else seemed to be asleep. I held Finnick tight and then took off toward the forest. On the way there, Finnick let out a soft sound of worry. "Are we going to the forest, Mommy?" he asked, and his tone was painted with fear. "Yes, baby," I said. "I'm so sorry we have to go there. I know you don't like it. But I need you to be brave, okay?" "Why do we have to go?" he pressed. I considered my words carefully. "You were right before," I decided. "The man we saw today. He's very bad and very dangerous. So we have to go somewhere to keep us safe." It wasn't a total lie. Asher Collins wasn't a good man, especially considering what he had done to me. When Finnick didn't reply, I asked him the question I know he didn't want to hear. "Are you afraid?" "No," he said firmly. "I'm not afraid. Let's leave. I'll protect you. I can walk." "Not now, sweetheart," I said quickly as he tried to wiggle in my arms. "Not before we pass the sentinels. Just stay here for right now." I held my son closer to my chest, and Finnick sighed. "Okay," he said simply, and he fell silent. It was for the best. Finnick would have been fine on foot, but there was a short interval just before midnight when there would be no guards around. This window was our only hope and it was minutes away. So, I quickened my pace and kept walking. Not too long after, we made it there, and to my delight, there were no guards around. I let out a sigh of relief and then walked straight into the forest. After we made it a good way in, I set Finnick down and reached into my pack. I'd brought a flashlight, a compass, and a knife with me. Retrieved them all, and after I put the knife in my pocket, I turned on the flashlight. The forest was pitch black around us, so we needed to rely on the flashlight to see. I used the light to check the compass. I wasn't an expert navigator, but I knew enough to get us through. We needed to avoid the forbidden section of the forest, so I had to find us a shortcut that would get us out of Wegala. If I timed things correctly, we could be on the other side of the forest by the morning. In the meantime, I needed to take every precaution to keep us safe. Now that I couldn't shift, I needed to keep my wits about me and keep us from making too many sounds or running into any predators. Luckily for us, my father had taught me how to use a knife when I was a girl, but I'd never had to use one before. I took Finnick's hand in mine. This was his first time entering the forest, and I could tell he was scared because his palms were wet. I felt pangs of guilt go through me. Putting Finnick in this much danger wasn't fair, but I had no other choice. I couldn't let the nightmares of Anamond come back to me, not again, and I wouldn't let them take my son. So, we began our walk through the forest. At first, the two of us were too afraid to speak. We continued on for an hour in complete silence, carefully maneuvering through the spiky trees together. Once we were a little further in, I relaxed my grip around Finnick's hand, and when I did, he cleared his throat. "Mommy?" he asked me quietly. "Yes, sweetheart." "How do you know the man is bad?" he wondered. I considered my answer carefully. "Well, I didn't tell you earlier, but I do actually know the man. I'm sorry I lied about it." Finnick fell silent. "I just didn't want you to worry about it, baby," I explained. "I didn't want you to worry about me." "It's okay, Mommy," he said very maturely. "I understand." The boy was already wise beyond his years, and again, I found myself admiring his emotional intelligence. He was going to be an extraordinary man one day, but for now, he was my best friend. Not too far ahead, fireflies began to light up, and Finnick grew excited. He dropped my hand and immediately rushed ahead. "Look, Mommy," he exclaimed, forgetting we needed to stay quiet. "I'm going to catch it." "Finnick," I called after him, but he kept going. He ran until I couldn't see him anymore, and I started to panic. Finnick, I called again. Suddenly, I heard a gasp, a thud, and then a scream. Mommy! Finnick yelled louder than I'd ever heard him before. I ran as fast as I could in the direction of his voice. Adrenaline kicked in and didn't stop until I spotted the top of his head with my flashlight. I sped even faster as Finnick screamed again. When I reached him, my heart stopped in my chest. Half of my son's body had fallen into a hole and was trapped between rocks. Chapter 10 Savior. Finnick, I cried. Mommy, Finnick shouted back through tears. Mommy, help me. I shined the flashlight over the rocks and coordinated a small path. I could get a better look at the situation if I shifted a little around them. Hold on, baby, I pleaded. Mommy is going to help. Just keep breathing. Okay, Finnick whimpered, and the sound tugged at my heartstrings. I followed the beams of light and made my way down over the rocks. It was a little difficult to navigate, but I had to save my son. When I reached the bottom, I shined the flashlight around me to get my bearings, and when I did, I realized we were at the entrance of a small cave. Somehow, Finnick had managed to stamp on it and get caught in between rocks. Keep breathing, Finnick, I urged him as he wiggled and writhed. I think I can get you out. I carefully climbed back up to the top of the rocks and over to Finnick. Even in the dark, I could see his cheeks were soaked from his tears. His lower lip trembled, and for the first time in a while, he was truly upset, not that I could blame him. I was on the verge of tears myself, but I needed to stay strong. I couldn't break down, not now. I'm going to try to pull you out, I warned him. Can you give me your arms? Oh okay, Finnick stammered, and he held his arms out in front of him. I carefully grabbed onto them and after I steadied my stance to make sure I was stable, I tugged. Finnick whimpered, and when I tried again to pull him out, he cried out. Oh, he whimpered. He was caught and most likely injured. My head spun a little bit as the guilt began to set in. If only I had held onto Finnick's hand, perhaps he wouldn't be in this position. Suddenly, a strange growl interrupted us, and I jumped in surprise. Mommy! Finnick screamed. The growl had come from behind us. My entire body shook as I turned around and pointed my flashlight in the direction of the sound, and then my eyes widened in horror. It was a bear. The beast's eyes flashed green and it growled again as it shifted a little from the light beam. This time, the sound was louder, and I caught a glimpse of the animal's teeth as it widened its mouth. We were in trouble. I carefully moved in front of Finnick, facing the bear. My body continued to shake in fear, but I couldn't let anything happen to my son. Shish, I whispered to him. Stay quiet. The bear watched me move and narrowed its eyes. It growled again and took a small step forward, and then one to the side. I was surprised it hadn't attacked us yet. Perhaps it wasn't hungry, and we were just trespassers in its territory. As the bear considered its actions, I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my knife. When I was a young girl, I'd heard stories of werewolves fighting bears during their hunts in graphic detail. The stories would involve a lot of blood, tearing of limbs, and then the heads of their kills being shown off to pack members as trophies. I'd never seen a bear head for myself, but I knew there was likely some truth to the tales. Of course, I couldn't shift anymore. As much as I wanted to fight the bear like a true werewolf, I was incapable. This plan to leave Wegala had been careless. How stupid it was of me to think we could get through this forest safely. The bear let out a roar. Perhaps it had finally grown annoyed, or maybe it had taken me for one of the werewolves who'd been out hunting today. Either way, the bear was riled up and ready to strike. When it lumbered forward, I gripped the knife tightly in my hand. This was it. We were going to fight. The bear was bulky, and its movements were a little clumsy as it came toward me. I stepped out quickly so our fight would be away from Finnick, and then squatted down to avoid the bear's massive paw. Adrenaline moved through me, and when the bear wiped again, I lunged out and sliced its paw. The bear roared again in pain, and blood sputtered over the rocks. Moments later, it swiped again, and this time I wasn't so lucky. It made contact with my arm, and my shoulder cried out as something cracked. I screamed, and Finnick behind me started to wail in terror. As the pain set in, I realized I had two choices. I could crumple to the ground and give up, or I could continue to fight and save us. So, I gathered all of my bravery, and as the tears streamed down my cheeks, I lunged again and shoved my knife into the bear's chest. The beast howled and shuddered as I pushed it in further, and then it pushed me aside with its arm. I fell to my feet and clutched my shoulder. My knife had been useful, but it was now trapped in the bear. I had nothing to defend myself with. The bear swiped its paw in the air, and I had this sick feeling that it wanted my head. It leaned back on its haunches, as if it were preparing to spring. I got down on the ground. This was inevitable. I didn't see a way out of this. As the beast howled and roared, I crawled over to Finnick. My son was sobbing, and I immediately threw my arms around him. "Don't cry," I urged him. "Don't cry, baby. I love you so much." "Mommy," he started to say, but his words dissolved into sobs. I let go of him after a moment and began to dig at the rocks that surrounded him. "When I get these out, I'm going to need you to get in the cave," I urged him. "Mommy, no," Finnick pleaded, but I shook my head. "You need to get down and into the cave," I repeated myself, my voice hardened. I'd never spoken to Finnick like that, but this matter was serious. Finnick nodded, and I kept pulling up the rocks. They tore into my hands, but I managed to shift them and soon, Finnick was able to move. "Come on, sweetheart," I urged. He shifted a little, and then winced in pain. But my brave boy was strong. He helped me shift more rocks until the hole was big enough for him to move. "I love you," I said, and then I pushed him down slightly. "Duck down into the cave, Finnick. Don't come out until I tell you to." Finnick did as he was told, and I watched as he disappeared down the hole and into the cave. Relief flooded through me. He was safe. Behind me, the bear roared, and my life flashed before me. This was likely it. My son was safe, but I was about to meet my maker. I was living on borrowed time anyway. I should have died 5 years ago. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my back, and dizziness rushed through me. A voice called out from somewhere far away, but my vision was too clouded to see anyone. I began to shake as the pain took hold. For a moment, I was frozen, but then I managed to raise my head. When I did, I saw someone I didn't expect. Asher Collins was approaching me. "I'm sorry, Cora," the Alpha King said smoothly. "I was late." "Asher," I whispered. He reached out and touched my cheek. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. The world around me suddenly went fuzzy. I was deluded. I had to be.